Hi, this is Josh Marshall, and this is the Josh Marshall Podcast. We are on our second episode of 2023. Since we spoke to you last, we finally have a Speaker of the House, Kevin McCarthy, and I think it's worth stepping back and saying that, at least in my mind, this was a an evolving story where conventional wisdom and non-conventional wisdom really didn't have a clear sense of what was going to happen. It was not a foreordained conclusion that Kevin McCarthy was going to be the speaker. I would say that there was a significant period of time when people were assuming that it was a losing battle for him. Um, at least in my mind, there was, I don't know what is, I guess this thing went on for 4 days. It was a total of 4 days, 4 days into the next morning of a fifth day. Um, and At least in my sense of how this evolved, there was the first 2 or 3 days, there was a lot of thinking of, you know, those 20 are not moving, period. And at some point, McCarthy's backers are going to say, love you, Kevin, but it's not happening. We need another plan. And when is that, um, when is that loosening of support going to happen? And is it going to come when, a Steve Scalise starts to get some attention or something like that? And if you're watching the TV coverage, there were constant invocations of this kind of uh almost cliche action where Kevin McCarthy's top lieutenants come to him and just say, it's not happening. We gotta, it sucks, it's not fair, we have to move on. um But something different happened. And at least in my sense, the turning point, not in any one thing, but what became clear is, like, the 20 aren't moving, but the 200 aren't moving either. And I don't think Kevin McCarthy is like a wildly liked guy up there on Capitol Hill. He doesn't have, it's not like he has like um, a lot of chits from a lot of people. I think it's probably fair to say that a lot of people don't have, I mean, it's hard to have a lot of respect for Kevin McCarthy, given the multiple transformations he has made over the last decade or so, and how much he has abnegated himself vis-a-vis Trump, vis-a-vis the Freedom Caucus, etc. But what I think he was able to do, and credit to McCarthy for managing to do this, was after a few days to basically say, "Look, I'm not dropping out. I'm not dropping out. Like, if Steve Scalise wants to come to the floor and say it's over, it's me, like, okay, we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. But you're not gonna see a breaking news thing where Kevin McCarthy says, okay, I guess it didn't pan out for me. I'm not backing out. And so it's those 20 people or it's me. And it's one or the other. If I go down, it means they won. And do you want to live in a house where they run things?" And for McCarthy's supporters, I think that was a pretty convincing argument. Now, the and so what we saw was his support did not start fraying. You had a couple people like Ken Buck, who's ideologically basically Freedom Caucus, saying, well, voting for Kevin this time, but next time, who knows? there were sort of some feints in that direction. But as far as I know, Ken Buck never voted against Kevin McCarthy. He kept threatening, but he went low energy. He wouldn't do it. So it solidified. McCarthy was able to basically solidify his support behind himself on the argument of, do you want to work for them? Do you want to work for Andy Biggs? Do you want to work for Matt Gaetz? And for a lot of the members of that caucus, the answer was no. No, I really don't. Those dudes suck. And so in my mind, at least, maybe halfway through that 4 or 5 day drama, something kind of shifted. And since McCarthy was not going to back out, you kind of start saying, eventually he's going to get this. Don't know how. And I'll say that even before that breakthrough where they had that, that deal that basically got almost everybody across, and they were down to like six or seven members. Even then, I mean, I'm certainly not saying the kind of like, oh, I saw what was coming. I didn't. It was just really hard to know where that was going to come together. And the other side of this is, do you want to work for Andy Biggs? Do you want to work for Matt Gaetz? Well, you are working for Andy Biggs and Matt Gaetz. You're just working under the, uh, the subcontractor, Kevin McCarthy. And that's kind of where we are. And so now we're in this new reality where, you've got Republicans have the House. They're kicking off all their new investigations. They are, they're starting to pass their, show bills, for lack of a better word. They just, overturned the hiring of the 87,000 new IRS agents, which they didn't overturn it because it's not law, so nothing has happened. They just passed a bill in the House, and there's also not 87,000 IRS agents, so the whole thing is nonsense. And what I hope Democrats are able to communicate to people, to make a big deal out of, is starting in 2010, or actually starting in 2011, Republicans very deliberately, with a very specific intent, started starving the IRS for funds. And that has two effects, both of which Republicans like. One of which is there's not a lot of resources to go after super wealthy tax cheats. And I mean people who have incomes of multiple millions or multiple tens of millions of dollars a year, sometimes much higher. I'm not talking about the person who's like, you know, uh, has a nice mid six figure income, the local hotshot lawyer. The big people, they don't have resources to make sure those people aren't cheating. The other thing, though, is that's why when you have a question with the IRS and you call up, you get a reply in 2 months. So on the one hand, it protects their donors who are cheating on their taxes. It also sows demoralization and discontent and anger in the federal government because it makes it impossible to work for the IRS. They don't have support personnel. I mean, imagine, you talk about when you uh, call up whatever company you're working for and you've got a dispute or you've got a question, you need phone support, blah 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 blah. Imagine a company that everyone in the country has to work with about very consequential stuff. You need a lot of staff. if you're not just referring everybody to the fact, right? So, so that's where we are. That is the new reality, um, and that doesn't even get into the fact that we're looking at, sometime over the course of this calendar year, probably late summer, early fall, we're going to get to a debt limit fight, which is going to be really, really bad. And you know, this should have been resolved under Democratic control. The basic answer is that Kirsten Sinema and Joe Manchin didn't want to do it. There's some other reasons that have to do with, we had a briefing couple months ago with a couple people. One of them is Adam Jenelson, who's the kind of the filibuster reform guy, but a guy who was a high level staffer for Harry Reid when Reid ran the Senate, and he said something very interesting, very distressing, but very interesting. That one of the reasons these things don't happen is that on the Senate side, you've got this there's a lot of kind of game theory explanations of how this stuff works. But basically, you say, "Hey, we got to resolve this brewing crisis that's going to happen, a year from now." And everybody basically says, "Well, a year from now is a long time. Like you maybe you do it. I don't want to do it. Like what if it goes badly? What if whatever? Not addressing problems in advance." But here's where we are, and I think it's also important, just because one group of people didn't confiscate all the guns from the terrorists doesn't mean it's not the terrorists' fault when they launch their terrorist attack, right? Let's get clear who's responsible and who is not. But anyway, that is what we're looking for going into 2023. Now, let me remind you before we get any further that the Josh Marshall podcast is brought to you by Grady's Cold Brew Iced Coffee. Cold Brew, the king of iced coffee, and Grady's, the king of cold brew. Brewed and bottled in New York City, Grady's all natural cold brew hit the coffee scene in 2011 and has been delivering the best artisanal cold brew ever since. Grady's bottles a New Orleans style concentrate for over 20 hours and uses a blend of 100% Arabica beans, imported French chicory, and signature spices brewed to bring you that authentic New Orleans experience without the airline ticket. For the DIY crowd, our bean bags contain the same blend of ground coffee beans, chicory, and spices we brew at our factory and makes up to 12 servings per pouch. Made in-house using all-natural, vegan, non-GMO, kosher, gluten-free ingredients, covered all the kind of like identity and political preferences there. Grady's velvety smooth coffee can be enjoyed hot, iced, spiked with cocktail. Ready to give it a swirl? Get 25% off at Grady'sColdBrew.com with promo code TPM. That's Grady'sColdBrew.com with promo code TPM. Okay, co-host Kate Riga, what's up? You're down there as part of our DC bureau. Have you been up to the Hill yet during this drama?
I went recently, but I guess not post the speakership fight. But yeah, so last time we recorded was on a weird Friday to accommodate my holiday travel schedule. And so we were talking kind of in the midst of the vote after vote after vote after vote time when it became clear that the strategy was just the war of attrition. And then we stopped recording, went back to our normal business. The House adjourned until 10 p.m. Our listeners will probably remember because House Republicans kind of realized that the endless streams of votes weren't going to get it done, so they wanted to take a few hours and try to move the holdouts. And then Kevin McCarthy came back, uh, you know, told reporters on his way in, "I've got the votes. This is it. We're going to do it." I believe this was the 14th vote at this point. Comes into the chamber. We're tracking all the votes, and by this point, you kind of know the universe of people that's gonna kind of make or break it. All comes down to Matt Gaetz. He misses the initial reading of his name. He was out of the chamber and then came into the chamber shortly after, which made me think, okay, he's setting himself up for his John McCain moment, right? It's all going to come down to him. He's going to make sure that he's one of the last people to go, so everybody's watching. He comes in and then he votes present, which in some scenarios is helpful to McCarthy, right? Because a present vote lowers the threshold he needs. But in this case, it left McCarthy a vote short. And then it was unlike anything I've ever seen in politics because we are just at a point, especially because Nancy Pelosi's been in charge for so long, where you're just not that used to seeing genuine confusion and a lack of a certain outcome play out before your eyes. With competent leadership, this is the stuff that happens behind closed doors. You do the bloodying up of the person or the, sticks and carrots to try to get them on your side, and you have that stuff locked down. And McCarthy thought he had that locked down, and then he went to the floor and the 14th vote failed too after he just told everyone that was it. He was going to become elected speaker.
Now, let me ask you something, because as I understand this, when the Republican members saw Gates vote present, at first everybody was like, "Awesome, okay, we got it,"
Mhm,
without
mhm,
realizing quite, because I mean, it's not rocket science, right? You don't have to be like in calculus where you're computing limits and stuff like that. But it is a little intricate, right? It's a bit of a
mhm.
game of Jenga or whatever, with how different, how nose and presence and all this kind of stuff works together. So for a second now, did Gates know what he was doing? I guess so. But the whole thing was a little
It was
confusing to
weird,
me.
exactly, yeah, like you say, it was confusing because the threshold of how many votes he needed kept changing, so it was just kind of hard to keep tabs on it, and then it sinks in, and McCarthy charges up the aisle. He goes to talk to Gates, and it's just it was a stunning moment. I mean, brought to us by an unrestrained C-SPAN, which was so lucky that we got to see this. But he is talking to Gates. He gets visibly frustrated in their conversation and kind of like throws his hands up and starts walking back. And you can hear him at one point, the mics pick up him saying, well, we'll just do it again then. But while the cameras are panning away to follow his kind of walk of shame back to his seat, we have Mike Rogers of Alabama come flying in from the top of the scene, and he has to be physically restrained as he lunges at Gates. And I'm sure our listeners by this point have seen some of the photos of that moment, which are truly like, Renaissance works of art. I mean, it's just so tense and so dramatic and, catches the moment of the movement and Gates kind of like shaking his finger in response. I mean, it was one of the most cinematic, dramatic scenes I've ever seen play out in the political sphere.
And for those of you who haven't seen it, either the photographs or the video, it's not just restrained in the sense of like someone kind of, holds him back a little. In the sort of the fracas in holding him back, the other member who was holding him back grabbed the front of his face, right? Like, I don't know if is that on purpose or not, but this isn't just kind of like you grab someone's arms and kind of like, all right, I'm not going to let you move any further. Grabs his face, and that's kind of just jagged and weird and kind of
Mhm.
bizarre. And I guess what is it? Kate, in the follow up reporting, it wasn't just that. It wasn't. At least my understanding is it wasn't just that. Obviously, Gates had thrown a wrench into the works one last time when they really thought they had it, but he thought that Gates had secured a subcommittee chairmanship. What is it? Armed Services. Basically, God, I'm spacing on the guys. What's the restrained guy's name again?
Rogers.
All right,
Mike
Rogers.
Rogers.
I think he's head of Armed Services. I think I have that right. And this would have been giving Gates a chairmanship of one of the subcommittees of armed services. But basically, the idea is that Gates had negotiated with McCarthy, sort of cutting into his power. So it wasn't just kind of like you screwed us up again. Uh, that he was kind of taking a bite out of the Rogers guy too. In any case, it got pretty out of control. I think we can
Yeah.
state with some confidence.
So after that, the 15th vote is when McCarthy was finally elected, and you kind of saw all the pieces falling into place. Nearly every defector, except for one or two, voted present. So voted, lowered the threshold to a place where he could win it. This is around probably
Were there
1:30
any were there
a.m. on
any
Saturday by this point.
Republicans who voted against on the final vote?
Yeah,
I
there
thought they
were.
there were. Okay.
Uh-huh. But just a couple.
Right.
So after that, you had Hakeem Jeffries get up and like give his, in my opinion, bit too long speech, and then you had McCarthy give his, which he actually opened with a joke that I legitimately found funny. He said to Jeffries, he was like, be careful. 2 years ago, I had 100% support from my caucus too, which is kind of like, I don't know, has some pathos, I guess,
Yep.
after seeing this man's just mortification play out, you know, on the big screen. But so now we have a Speaker McCarthy, and some of the unresolved pieces, because now we're recording this on Wednesday. Republicans have also voted for the rules package um, to govern this Congress. And the mysterious thing here is, what's known as the 3-page addendum, which is this document which now some people are saying doesn't exist at all, but which apparently consisted of the biggest concessions that McCarthy had to make to, the Gateses and the Boberts and the other part of this hardliner defector group to make them support his candidacy. And that is reportedly where the big juice is, right? The rules package was like not that controversial. It was kind of just like opening up Congress to the people again and stuff like that. But the rules package is where we think the debt ceiling stuff is,
Oh, the 3-page thing, you mean?
right. The
Right,
addendum
right,
is
right.
where perhaps the debt ceiling stuff is, perhaps uh the jostling of committees, the power sharing agreement, all that kind of stuff. But so Punchbowl is the one who first reported the existence of this 3-page addendum. The weird thing is, not only have reporters not seen it, which like okay, apparently they're being holding it close to the vest, don't want it to leak. But basically, no House Republican seem to have seen it either. And the thing that's a bit weird to me is like, okay, if you're a Matt Gaetz and you kind of emerged from this as a winner, maybe you don't have a huge interest in seeing it go public. I don't know, even though he likes everything he does to be public. But if you're not one of those House Republicans, like, aren't you kind of interested in what was given away to secure their report? And there's been grumblings here and there. Nancy Mace from South Carolina was making some noise about voting against the rules package until she saw the 3-page addendum, which she ended up not doing. She voted for it anyway. But the rules package, which would have been a big point of leverage for those House Republicans who wanted to see it, that passed pretty drama free. They didn't use that. So they seem to have like a quite lack of curiosity about what's going on over there.
Yeah, I mean, I think, they, uh, in many ways, last week was a pretty traumatic event for House Republicans, right? It was embarrassing. There's no question it has really damaged Republican standing. You can see it in polls and stuff like that. It's really made them very unpopular. Obviously, it's 2 years till another election, so it doesn't really matter, right? But still, they don't want to go back to that. And I think they have a sense of they basically know what's there, but they don't know exactly. And what is most telling is it must be pretty bad if they won't even show it to their own members, let alone disclose publicly. And one thing that came up in it's very uh, it's very murky. But one thing that came up in the sort of the back and forth yesterday is that some people say there actually is no 3-page document, that it's just a verbal understanding, and others say there is a 3-page document, but that stuff, the 3-pager has the kind of semi bad stuff, but there's other even worse stuff, and obviously I'm saying worse from a certain perspective, the sane person's perspective, let's say, that's not even committed to paper there. And just for context here, for listeners, um, the rules package stuff is there's a certain amount of the rules package stuff that is on its face not necessarily even a bad thing. There's a basic change that happened in the governance of the House of Representatives going back about 30 years. Basically starts under Gingrich, but when Democrats come into power, they largely adopt this as well. It's variously called martial law, suspending regular order. The old system is things get worked out. You've got a big budget document, the committees sort of work through things, come up with it's a whole process. And then there are amendments and stuff like that. Okay. Um, Starting again 30, 30 or so years ago, you have a much more top down approach that the leadership basically runs the house. Here's what it's going to be. Here's what we're going to do. Um, Here's the bill, and you vote for it, and that's kind of it. And there are and that's one of the reasons you increasingly have all of these sort of omnibus bills where kind of you don't go through the normal the normal what used to be the normal budgeting process. One of the things that I think they got, and again in the abstract is not at all a bad thing, is that when you introduce a bill, when you introduce that big mega omnibus bill, you can't have a vote for 72 hours. So everybody gets a chance to look at it and kind of raise concerns and stuff like that. That's not an unreasonable thing, right? That is not some crazy wingnut idea. That is a more normal, functional, led parliamentary process. The counter to that is that the reason a lot of that stuff happens now is that antics, largely on the right, have made the House kind of ungovernable. But regardless, the point is the stuff in the rules package isn't the main stuff. The big stuff is agreements about pushing for a debt default, agreements about stacking certain key committees with members of the Freedom Caucus. And one of those is the Rules Committee. People don't talk much about the rules, or off Capitol Hill, people don't talk a lot about the Rules Committee. But the Rules Committee is well, where the rules get devised. Where kind of like, all right, how are we going to hold this vote? How many amendments are there allowed to be? If we vote on X, are we going to allow a vote on an alternative to it? Republicans have their bill. Are we going to let the Democrats also vote on their version of it? I mean, there's fewer Democrats, so kind of it's not it's not really giving up too much. That's the stuff where those are the agreements in which McCarthy has basically given to the Freedom Caucus people the rights to run the show. And they are not, as Kate says, they are not revealing even to their own members quite what he agreed to. And a lot of those things aren't even supposed to be up to them. I mean, obviously, a powerful speaker gets what they want, but in the Republican caucus, sort of who gets to be chairman of this committee and that committee and who gets to sit on this committee, that stuff's voted on by the caucus. So, they're realizing that, again, he has, in order to become speaker, he has basically signed over control of the House to these, you know, 30 or so hardcore members. And that's where we are.
And now we've gotten into the first legislation being introduced of the new term. The White House issued its first veto threat, even though the bill it's about, which you, Josh, alluded to in the intro, the IRS rescinding the funding that it got from the Infrastructure Act, that will never pass the Senate, so there's really no risk of it getting to Biden's desk. But it is premised on this conspiracy theory that they just it really is kind of astonishing how many Republicans buy into it, and not just the usual suspects, but even ones that in a prior time would have been considered, normal Republicans, maybe even respected Republicans, like Chuck Grassley, people like that, have just parroted this, that the 87,000 new armed IRS agents thing, which, just the quick debunking of it is that figure comes from a report that predates the act that allotted the money. They are trying to staff up, but these people are not all going to be armed IRS agents. There are only 2,000 of those in the whole institution, and they
Well, and they're
don't.
already they're not even all agents.
Right.
They're not even
And
all the investigators. It's also kind of like people who work the
customer
call
service
centers.
and stuff.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
And as it is, the armed agent contingent, is not kicking down the doors of middle America to like get you to file your W-2s. They're there for when tax crimes overlap with other crimes, like, human trafficking kind of thing. Um, so that's not what it's about. Like you say, the battle against the IRS for the Republicans is at this point, decades long thing, and clearly benefits them politically. But so that's kind of what they came out of the gate with. The White House, railed against it, said we will veto it. This is empowering tax cheats at the expense of normal Americans. And then the other thing that Republicans are coming out with from the beginning is this trio of anti-abortion legislation. A lot of it, which is they've done before, or at least have had kind of anti-abortion panics about before. So there's one that would make the Hyde Amendment, which stops federal funding from being used for abortions. That would make that permanent. As of now, it's a rider that annually gets attached to HHS funding, and Democrats have recently kind of started about talking about stripping it out. So there's that. We've got the Born Alive Act, which is just totally made up, but premised on this idea that babies are born during botched abortions and that doctors then murder them on the surgery table. So it would make those doctors liable for criminal charges. Just the reality of the situation is when you are having an abortion late enough in a pregnancy that a baby could be born that could survive independently from the womb. Those are extremely rare, virtually always tied to tragic circumstances like fetal abnormalities or the woman's life being in risk. And then the third one is just kind of a condemning attacks on anti-abortion organizations and facilities, which also does the work of trying to erase the very long, rich history of violence from the anti-abortion movement to clinics and providers, which obviously there have been several murders, kidnappings, bombings, arsons. There's just a lot there. So anyway, that's kind of the trio they're going out with. And Josh, as we were discussing pre-recording, none of those things is a national ban, right? Which is interesting because
Or
otherwise you
even
get
or even restriction,
right.
like restriction to 15 weeks or something like that.
Which is kind of interesting because in some ways this shows they're not moderating on abortion, right? They're still kind of backing these extreme bills that, in the same way that Republicans have for a long time, that they've kind of proposed these bills written with very emotional language, oftentimes written to solve a problem that doesn't exist, or that doesn't exist the way that they are saying that it exists. And that in real life, now we're seeing this stuff has really deadly consequences for women. But we're back into this old, even though Dobbs totally turned abortion politics on its head, House Republicans are kind of back doing what they've always done, which is feeling comfortable and proposing all these bills that maybe could be damaging if they were ever passed into law, but they know they're not going to be passed into law. So it's almost like a time capsule of what it was like pre-Dobbs, when Republicans could just churn out this anti-abortion legislation knowing it wouldn't matter. You don't really have to think through the downstream effects. You can just put your name on the bill and be like, I'm a pro-life warrior, and just leave it at that.
Yeah, it's telling on a few different levels that they have, there's no constitutional restriction now that says they couldn't pass a bill in the House. That's not a law, obviously, for the reasons we've discussed. But they could just say, "Hey, we are banning abortion nationwide." They could do what I take it Ron DeSantis is doing in Florida, 15-week ban, and they're not doing that, and that is telling at a few levels. Despite not moderating on various fronts, I think they see that that's really kryptonite for them at the moment. And I suspect that within the internal conversations on this, a lot of them are saying, look, we don't have the Senate. Joe Biden's president. So, what is the logic of giving Democrats, giving abortion rights supporters this huge cudgel to delegitimize us when it is never going to become law? Like, maybe this is something we do in 2025. I suspect it will be something they do in 2025, but there's no logic to it now. I mean, obviously they do a lot of things there's not a lot of logic to, but it is revealing that they are making some level of, kind of calculated decision to hold up a bit here. And I suspect these things that they are passing are basically to keep the pro-life, anti-abortion zealots on side. Because, if you're them, you're thinking, wait a second, we've been working for this Dobbs decision for 50 years. You're in control. Where's our ban? What the hell? So you dish off these, kind of partial birth and deep state against pro-life activists kind of things to make them feel like they're you know getting some love, for lack of a better word, even though they're not really going for it.
So the other thing we wanted to talk about in this fresh and new term of Congress is the ever intriguing George Santos, who has spent his first few days being chased around by flocks of reporters while he gets lost in the labyrinth that is the Capitol. Today, just kind of minutes before we started recording, the Nassau County GOP called for his resignation. We've got a former congressman in the mix calling for his resignation. So far, Republican leadership has just bobbed and weaved, just
Now,
kind of avoided talking about it.
now the thing we've seen today is that, like, formally the Nassau County GOP, and for people who aren't for the New York area, Nassau County is, you've got New York City, and then you've got Long Island to the immediate east, where there are two counties on Long Island. There's Nassau and Suffolk. Nassau is the western one, the one closer into the city. So it is that's the county that borders New York City, and most of Santos's district is in Nassau County. Is it, like, formally
Mm-hmm.
Nassau County, not just like all the big wigs in the Nassau County GOP, but formally the county party is saying you should resign.
Press conference at the leadership, party officials led by the chairman. So sounds pretty
Sounds like
official.
it. Yeah, yeah. And I guess what is it? They have is it one of the new or is a former they've basically kind of lined up everybody.
Mm-hmm.
And it is interesting that it's an interesting dynamic because as you said, the House leadership is not they are in no rush here for obvious reasons. They've got a four vote yeah, they've got a 4 vote majority.
Mm-hmm.
Um it's certainly not certain that Democrats would win a special election, but it's generally a Democratic seat. So you have to assume that that is a decent possibility. And I would imagine it's a, you know, it's a tough environment at the moment
Mm-hmm.
for another Republican. Give us another bite at the apple. I don't lie as much as George did. Um, but it's interesting that the locals, they want him out. They really want him out. And that is, uh, from one perspective, you can say, well, Josh, he's a pathological liar. Of course they want him out. But that doesn't seem to be swaying Steve Scalise and Kevin McCarthy.
Right. It looks
So,
like we also, while we've been recording, have our first sitting House GOP member to call on him to resign,
and who's
which is
that?
Anthony D'Esposito from New York's 4th District.
Now, is he's another one of those freshmen, right?
I
I
think
think
that's
so.
right. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. Well, I mean, this is these New York members are going to be a big deal
Mm-hmm.
over the next 2 years. Um, some of them, you have you have the woman who was reelected to the basically the Staten Island district. Is it Maliatakis? I
Oh.
believe her name is. Um, she what is it? She had, I think she served before. I, she's in her second term. You have, I believe, 4 freshmen, among whom George Santos is one. All of those are kind of, I don't know, say dead men walking, but they're all in a pretty tough spot going into 2024. Some of them are in districts that are legit swing districts, even vaguely Republican districts. Others are just sitting in Democratic districts. People didn't really think they had much chance of winning. It's easy. It's obviously much easier to win in a midterm when there's less turnout. These are basically most or all these people are in Biden districts. So those are the people who, when you talk about maybe some group of Republicans saying, look, we're not going to go along with this debt default thing, you've got to figure it's those New York Republicans that are at the top of the list of people in that category. You've got the guy, I believe his name is Lawler, in New York 17th district, which is just north. It's basically Westchester and Putnam and part of maybe Rockland. I can't remember exactly. Just outside the city, kind of like an hour outside the city. He beat the head of the DCCC, which is a pretty good, kind of hat trick. And so does that person want to go into next year's election saying, yeah, I could have prevented the debt default, but I needed to stay true to Kevin McCarthy. So all of the these New York types, you've got a few in sort of similar situations out in California, maybe 1 or 2 in Florida. But that's kind of where the action is going to be
Yep.
going forward.
So now we're going to do a few questions. The first is from Greg, who says, "Now that the House speakership fight is over, I'm wondering how House moderates, a group that apparently calls itself the governing caucus, had no sway in the negotiating and the votes."
Um, Good question. I think they, to the extent they had a sway, they probably had some sway, basically saying, "Don't come back to us with Steve Scalise, or don't come back to us with some rando who's just going to kind of follow uh, the Freedom Caucus." Um, follow the Freedom Caucus line. It's McCarthy or no one. Now we know that McCarthy is sort of as down with the Freedom Caucus as anybody because that's his whole plan. But I do think that is they probably did exercise some control there because as much as McCarthy uh, couldn't afford to lose, 4 or 5 members to his right. Whoever else was going to replace McCarthy, or McCarthy himself, couldn't lose people on the other side. Um, the other thing to remember with sort of notional Republican moderates, and even giving them that label is questionable at some level. Even take this Lawler guy, who is the one I just mentioned, the one who's in the 17th district. It's an hour outside of New York City, kind of quintessential what now counts as a Republican moderate. Even if you're a Republican moderate, you still have 30% of the Republicans in your district who are down the line Freedom Caucus Trumpers, basically. So if you're the guy who, you know, upset the apple cart of all the sort of the Freedom Caucus wish lists, you've got a problem in your district, even if it's a pro-Biden district. Even if Biden won it 55-45, because you can be primaried. And, I don't know if it's the answer to the question, but that's kind of why, what what juice do these people really have, and how much can they really defy these extremists, since to a great extent they rely on those extremists to get them reelected. Not
It's
exclusively the extremists, but enough of them.
It's really interesting because this batch of New York Republicans are in a pickle that is just becoming increasingly rare in our House landscape, because now we've had so many cumulative years of gerrymandering that there are hardly any competitive House races anymore. Basically, this cycle in particular, states that had already gerrymandered to hell, particularly Republican ones, just tried to shore up their seats, make them even less competitive. And in New York, with the whole debacle we've outlined on the show before, when the Democrats' attempt to do an aggressive gerrymander got tossed out, the result of that is genuinely competitive districts. And so now these House Republicans are trying to tread a line that most of their peers don't have to do anymore. For their
Yep.
peers, it's just about surviving the Republican primary, which obviously encourages this kind of march towards authoritarianism and towards the hard right. But these people actually have to do that old dance of surviving a primary, but not making themselves so Trumpy and toxic in the process that they can be a Democrat in the general. So, what once was a much more of a widespread problem equation to solve here is now just for the select few. And I do think another interesting dynamic here is that all these people are freshmen. So they are in this weird position where they have leverage and are in this unique political situation, but also have been on the Hill for like 2 days. So it's an interesting leverage dance to do here.
Yeah, and the other thing, remember, is there are 18 there are, my understanding is there are 18 Republican members who are in Biden districts that Biden won. Now, obviously, Biden winning covers a lot of territory, right? If Biden won 59-40, 51-49, that's very different from, like, 40 to 60 or something like that. But still, that means if you're any, and let's remember too, Biden was running against Trump. But having said all that, that means that you have to face a real election, a real general election, a district in which Biden won means there are enough Democrats to defeat a House Republican. So yeah, it's that is really going to be where the action is, and I think the basic overriding question is, let's take that 20. Let's take that as a kind of a cardinal number, the 20 holdouts. Well, you've got 18 on the other side, as I said, that are in Biden districts. From the outside, you might say, well, two can play this game, right? But in practice, we have seen that the moderates don't play like the Freedom Caucus types do. Even though they can, numerically they can, it's just not how they roll. So a lot of the question is going to come down to, how do they roll? Are they going to? I have a post, I'm lose track of this sometimes. I think I haven't published it yet, that I'm working on, about something called a discharge petition. Now, this is for people who don't, spend time on Capitol Hill, a relatively obscure parliamentary tool. It basically goes like this: any member of the House can draw up a petition that says, I want this bill to come to the floor. I don't care what the speaker says. I want to vote on this bill. If that member can get a majority of members of the House to sign that bill will come to a vote. Now, normally, I don't know, this happens maybe once a Congress. It's pretty rare. And the reason is that it's one thing to, vote in a way that your party, kind of against what your party wants. But to defy your speaker in that way, that's like, you know, you don't do that. That's something you kind of can't come back from necessarily. That's a big breach. Although, in a lot of ways, that's what just happened in this whole speaker thing. The Republican caucus voted. They voted for Kevin McCarthy. He won overwhelmingly. The way that's supposed to work is the people who opposed him say, okay, I didn't support him, but we all agreed, so now we're all going to vote for him. So they've already kind of broke that, they broke that taboo. But right now, and the other thing is, usually you've got, a majority of 10 or 20, 30, 40, got a lot of votes. Now you've only got 4. It's pretty hard to get, 25 members of the speaker's party to defy him or her that way. But here you only need 4, or I guess you need 5, depending on what happens with Santos and stuff like that. And so that's going to be a big deal. Are they willing to do that? Are they willing to say, hey, I'm not down for this debt ceiling thing, or I'm not down for this government shutdown, or I'm not down for this? So they've got a lot of power. And you have, again, a lot of these members in New York State that, they kind of got in on a fluke in 2022. A lot harder during a presidential election. So they've got the power. Do they wield it? History tells us the moderates are squishes, not just ideologically, but characterologically, right? They just don't roll that way, but we'll see. That's really the kind of question that hangs over this whole Congress.
And then we have a question from Ben who says, now that it's clear we're headed towards a debt ceiling hostage crisis, do the Democrats have a messaging plan? He says Republicans will make absurd demands, the Democrats will refuse them, and then Republicans will say, they're willing to negotiate, and Democrats are the one being intransigent. As you've noted, the Washington media is wired for the GOP, so they'll echo this message too. What is Democrats' next move to make sure the public is clear about who owns this? And this is a really good question because it absolutely captures the dynamics of the way this has gone. That Republicans are able to hold the debt ceiling hostage while claiming that they're being fiscally responsible. The Beltway kind of places just echo that uncritically. And then it somehow does shift the onus to Democrats, the ones who are trying to be responsible with the debt ceiling, to be the ones who play ball. But I think the other thing is, after the fact, things do tend to get clearer. I think the Tea Party Republicans who kind of started this back in 2011, they did end up taking the brunt of the responsibility for doing this. And that has kind of been the trend, even though I do agree that a lot of the coverage in the moment is, it puts the onus on the Democrats to resolve the problem. But we have seen that Republicans do end up eating the responsibility for this, or at least they have in the past.
Yeah, I think there's been, we've had a kind of a little mini crisis since 2011, nothing really like that. But I think the idea of debt ceiling hostage taking has kind of seeped into conventional campaign coverage of this
Yeah.
is what that is. And the other thing, and this was a kind of a cardinal mistake that Barack Obama made, which I think he later realized and was open about, was you don't negotiate. There's nothing to negotiate here. We're not negotiating over. And one of the many ironies here is what we're really talking about here is whether we will pay the bill for what we already bought under President Trump and under a Republican Congress. So I think that's part of it, of kind of like, you pay your bills. If let's say you grant the Republican argument about, oh, you ran up your credit card bill. When you run up your credit card bill, maybe you be more responsible going forward, but you still have to pay your credit card off. That's just not how it works. And everybody understands that in this country, unless they, end up going bankrupt or something like that. Or, with a dead credit rating. So, but I think the other part of it is what we just discussed. They need to be laying the groundwork about the 18. You guys can solve this. Are you going to solve it? And they really need to be focusing it on them, because they are the ones who have the power to get the country out of this. And they need to be, it's sort of a balance, because you want to be hammering these people, but you also want them to do the right thing. Right. So I really think the message is mostly focused on those people. These are for the people in those New York districts. Hey, your congressman can solve this. Let them know what you think. Right. You got to place the pressure there. So I think that's, in addition to being clear, like, we're not going to negotiate with hostage takers. That's really the key, to sort of to be laying the groundwork with those 18.
And I think we do have some inclinations that Democrats are thinking that way as well. We had a Biden speech, maybe a few months ago at this point, where the first time that the kind of plan to take Medicare and Social Security hostage really emerged from the Republican Party, where he said, under no circumstances am I going to allow them to cut these programs. I will not yield, kind of staking out that position. And I think that's the one that Democrats want to take, which is a position of principle, a position of protecting people's rights, and not folding to this just kind of destructive clown show from the people who have already established themselves as the ones who are kind of running the circus in the Republican Party.
Right. Okay.
All right.
I think we've covered it. Well, 2 episodes down of quality content for 2023 so far.
Right.
Thank you as always, Kate, and thank you to our producer, Jackie. And I think that's it for this week. Wait, before, it's not quite it, because I have to remind you that the Josh Marshall podcast brought to you by Grady's Cold Brew Iced Coffee, the most amazing iced coffee in the world. You can get 25% off your order if you use the promo code TPM at their website, which is Grady'sColdBrew.com. And that's it for this week.
All right, we'll see you next week.
Later.
The Josh Marshall podcast is hosted by me, TPM reporter Kate Riga, and TPM founder, editor-in-chief Josh Marshall. The show is produced by Jackie Wilhelm. Thanks to Why Not Jansfeld for our podcast theme song, and thanks to all our TPM members who make this possible. Rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, and subscribe wherever you listen.